Okay, so as we dive into Ephesians chapter 5, and we are picking up really in verse 21. 21 is the connector verse between the first half of Ephesians 5 and the second half. But we're really going to be looking at relationships in a variety of different ones. So as we've been marching through Ephesians, there's been talk about unity, there's been talk about God's plan, and the value of the church, and how the church is to be knit together under Christ. So here we start talking about specific relationships. We move into the realm of specifics. So as we begin to look at that and a variety of different ones, why should we as Christians care so much about relationships and getting them right, whatever right looks like? It's going to be one of those mornings. Okay.
All right, I'll jump on that.
Okay. Thank you, there.
So if you get back to like the real fundamentals, we're talking base roots, what are the core beliefs that we carry? One of those is that we are made in God's image, right? And what does that mean? I mean, as a kid, I thought, oh, he looks like us. Well, that doesn't even make sense, to be honest.
Right.
But when we're made in God's image, we have consciousness, we have personality, and including emotions. And so if we stop and think about it, given the vastness of the universe, what is left? What is the most important thing? It's relationships. It's because we are in God's image, how do we treat each other is more important than that next galaxy that's going to come. That's pretty fun. That's mind-blowing. For sure.
Right. So at its core, human beings are made in the image of God, and those connections between people matter. Yeah. Anything else? Why should you care about relationships?
It's everything. Just stop and think about it. Every facet of life is a relationship with somebody on some level.
Right. Even, I mean, you've got customers that you see maybe, you might see them only one time, right? But that's still a relationship. Yeah. So every connection you have with people is a relationship of some sort. Even the negative ones, right? If you have an enemy, still a relationship. Might be a dysfunctional one, but still a relationship. Any other reasons we should care?
I think we just covered over the body just not too long ago.
Mm-hmm.
And even in our own body, we think, oh, well, everything is in control and they're all working together. But no, they're actually all working independently and they communicate with each other. Mm-hmm. So our cells, even on a cellular level, have like little tags on them to indicate that they're healthy, they're functional, where they should be, what they should do. And our brain takes a look at all these different cells and body organs and parts and goes, okay, thank you for doing that, do a little bit more of this, or maybe go over here, do that. So it's communicating. And so us as a body, in order for us to function properly, in order for us to do the work, we have to communicate and we have to have good relations with each other.
So one aspect of relationships is we can't glorify Christ as His body if we're not communicating with each other. Any others? Yeah.
I guess it's because God cares about relationships and people, so we should care about what He cares about.
Okay, and what that's about is basic and fundamental idea as it is, right? If God cares, we should care. And He does. He very much cares. Any other thoughts?
Relationship can make or break you as a Christian. Take a good relationship and it will make you stronger, but if you make the wrong choice in your relationships, it can break you as a Christian, pull you away from God.
Great point. We hammer in that bad company corrupts good morals. We try and hammer that into our kids. But it's not just the kids who should be listening to that. We've got to pick good relationships and because the good ones, they'll make you stronger. The bad ones will destroy you. My number one advice that I give to young people when they're looking for a spouse is I go, look for somebody who's going to help you get to heaven. And that you can help get to heaven too, by the way. You should not be the dead weight in that equation. But it's true. They'll make or break you. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
We're to be imitators of God, and it's all about having a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And we should do the same for others.
Yeah, so in imitation of God who loves relationships and loves people, we should love people too. So as you begin to look at it, you get this very clear picture, and I think Mike said it best, relationships are everything. I mean, on every level, good or bad, functional, dysfunctional, that's how you're really going to count up your life at the end. It won't be the stuff, it'll be the people. And so with all of that in mind, when we look in Ephesians chapter 5, we see this phrase, subject. Submitting to one another in reverence for Christ. Which gets at some of the ideas that we talked about already about relationship. One of the reasons that we should be concerned about relationships is because God cares about people. We should care about people. God tells us it's important. It should be important to us. But as soon as you start to talk about relationships and having healthy ones, you immediately run into this word submit or be subject to. And that's where we don't like it. That's where the problem starts to come in. Because relationships are great until I have to subject myself to another person. And so that becomes, especially in an American culture, a very ugly word. So the Greek word there is hupotassos. That particular word comes from two other Greek words, and it just means to place underneath, is really what it means. It's if it were a physical object that you were subjecting, you would just be putting it underneath another object. And so in our relationships, we're told to put underneath ourselves the other person. This is not an Ephesians only concept. It shows up 1 Corinthians 15 verse 28. Now when all things are made subject to him, then the Son himself will also be subject to him who put all things under him, that God may be all in all. It's an interesting thing that here you have Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15, and the whole point is that ultimately everything will be subjected to Jesus. So he's up here and everything's underneath him. But then as soon as that happens, what does 1 Corinthians 15 say will occur? The Son himself subjects himself to the Father. So it's not a bad word, right? It's not a bad thing. Even though we live in a culture that says subjecting yourself, you should be in charge and do what you want and don't let people control you, and all these different phrases that we use based off of the idea of I want to be me and do me the way I want. We understand when you look at 1 Corinthians 15 at least that Jesus subjects himself. So Jesus is okay with the idea of subjection. It is not something that's wrong, but for us to do it instead, it's an imitation. Luke 10 verse 17 shows you another usage of the word. The 7 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. If you are wondering what level of power that word subject or submission has, imagine the usage here. When they say even the demons are subject to our name, what do they mean by that? The 70 go out and they say the demons are subject to our name. What do they mean? Yeah, they can cast them out. They can tell them what to do and they will do it. So it has a lot of power in it. That's the other thing. We can't, we shouldn't dilute the word down to where it means, just be nice to people in a general sort of way. The word subjection does involve this idea of doing something based off of somebody else. Romans 8, because the carnal mind is enemy to God, for it is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can be. One of the other things that we're taught as you look at Romans is that one of the characteristics of a fleshly mind, of a thought process that isn't about God, is that it doesn't subject itself to the law of God. One of the points that was brought up was, why should we care about relationships? And the short answer is because God tells us to. That's a subjection answer, isn't it? Why should I care? Do I need to know why? All I need to know is God told me to. That's subjecting ourselves to the law of God. But the carnal mind fights against that. The fleshly mind says, I'm only going to subject if I know all the reasons why, and it seems like a good idea to me, and it's in my best interest. We put all those pieces together, and then I'll subject. But biblically, are there times that God tells you to do things, and He doesn't tell you why? And He doesn't consult you? So subjection sometimes involves that type of obedience. Then Luke 2:51, He went down with them and came to Nazareth. This is Jesus as a child. And it says, and He was subject to them, but His mother kept all these things in her heart. You don't have to, the person you're subjecting yourself to doesn't have to be a better person than you even. That's another truth that we find. Because who is a better person? Jesus' earthly parents, Mary and Joseph, or Jesus? This is Jesus, right? Can we agree on that premise that Jesus is better than Joseph and Mary, right? But He subjected Himself to them. So there is a concept that it's not just, well, I'll subject myself to somebody who is either more powerful than me or wiser than me. Although certainly that happens too. That's not a requirement, right? I don't have to, the person I'm subjecting myself to does not have to be better at being a person than me. If that were the case, then Jesus wouldn't have ever done this. So, as we look at that word subjection, one of the things that we want to keep in mind is it's a term that's used for all relationships. And one of the reasons I bring this up is, and part of this is the way your Bibles are broken down in your modern translations. A lot of times you get these little headings that get thrown in before the text. And they go, okay, this is where the subject change happens. Verse 22 for most of your Bibles is where they put the little heading. Mine says, marriage is like Christ and the church. So verse 22, what's the very first verse you run into? What does it say there? Wives submit. Husband's favorite verse. Right? If you take it and rip it out of its context, we create subjection as something that is done in one particular relationship, and we focus on that. When in reality, if you back it up one verse, because this is a letter and Paul didn't put those little headings in there, where does the subjection begin? It doesn't begin with wives. It begins with all of us being subject to one another. And it also says in verse 21, it's in reverence for Christ. So subjecting to other people and their needs is an act of reverence for Christ. It isn't even about the person. So some of the relationships that we're going to look at will be like a slave with a master. Well, what if the master is a bad master? Can a slave subject themselves to a master that's not a good person? Biblically, yes, because it's not about the master. It's about reverence for Christ. So, if we have in our mind that I'm going to pay attention to the verses that talk about somebody else being subject to me, we've missed the point. All right, so in the husband-wife relationship, verse 22, who's that verse to? To wives, right? So husbands, stop listening. It's not about you. And then, when it goes and talks about the responsibility in verse 25 of husbands, wives, stop listening. It's not about you. It's about their act of reverence for Christ in the role of marriage. Does that make sense? It's not a tool to tell your spouse what they need to do. It's a tool for you to look at and say, how do I, in reverence, exist in my marriage? Or whatever relationship it is, because we're going to talk about a lot of different relationships. So the key to it is we can't twist it in our head and look for the ones where I'm the one that people are being subject to. I need to look for the ones where I'm the one subjecting myself. And when I begin to look at it like that, then all of a sudden things start clicking on all cylinders. So this is where the rubber meets the road, is you have all of these different relationships, and each relationship you've got one job. And we also look at these on the internet. These crack me up. The you had one job signs. I should have one of these. I think I mentioned in a sermon a while ago when I put the hot and the cold backwards on a shower. You had one job. But you have one job. You have one job. You have one job. You have one job. And this one is my favorite. Because it takes a long time to put that midfield logo in. Right? And the reason I bring this up is kind of a hilarious thing is we've all done something like this before. Where we get in our mind, I'm doing the thing, right? So you imagine the guy, he's out there, he's painting the logo on the field. And you get the whole logo painted. But there was one thing that really had to be right. Like you can mess up a couple of other things and nobody ever noticed. But if you miss midfield, man, right? You had one job. You're building the cabinets, you get the whole thing together and the doors don't open. It doesn't matter how nice they look when they're closed. Here's the thing. Subjection is your one job in every relationship. I'm convinced of it. It's your one job in every relationship. Now, it looks different in different relationships, right? So subjection in your marriage looks different than subjection in your parenting. Subjection with your boss looks different than it does with your parenting. Subjection with your friends looks oftentimes quite different than subjection with your enemies. So it's going to, practically speaking, bear itself out a little differently. But in every relationship, you've got one job. How can I submit to one another in reverence for Christ? So, with that in mind, Ephesians gives us a variety of circumstances where we can look at how can we submit? How can we be subject to one another? And ultimately what this comes down to is meeting the needs of the other person in that relationship. Now, once again, meeting the needs of that person in the relationship is going to look different. Meeting the needs of my wife is going to look a lot different than meeting the needs of my enemy. Because sometimes your enemy, what they need is not what they want. Right? But in the first one, how does a wife submit to her husband? Well, it says, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. So in what way does a wife subject herself to her husband? She treats him like Lord. Does that mean he deserves that title? Has he earned it? No, absolutely not. Husbands, can we agree that we have not earned the title of Lord? Right? But do you need respect and trust in leadership? Over and over and over again, they found the same thing to be true. That men, and this is a thing that the Bible's been saying for thousands of years, and then the science catches up to what God's been saying all along. If a man has a choice between being loved by everybody, but respected by nobody, or being respected by everybody and loved by nobody, if he's given that choice, do you know which one men choose over and over and over again? They would rather be respected and not loved than loved and not respected. And to some of you, that might sound crazy. You go, I can't imagine waking up in the morning and thinking, nobody loves me, but they all respect me. That might be your worst nightmare. And as a general stereotypical truth, that's the case for women. That's not always true. Everything in terms of stereotypes, right? There's wiggle room there. But as a general rule, men value respect more than love. That's not that we don't care about love, right? It's not, you kind of like some of both. But the need, especially in the position as a husband, is if you're going to lead, You need to feel respected. You need to feel trusted. And so that's a way that a wife can meet that need. It doesn't say he's deserving of it. It doesn't say that he's earned it. In fact, if you get a young couple and they get married, and you look at a young husband and he's never done this at all, what are the chances he's going to make some mistakes? If your number is less than 100%, you are wrong. Right? He's definitely going to make some mistakes. Some really big ones. He's going to do some really stupid things along the way. But if his wife can offer him respect and trust, he will rise to meet that. As a general rule. That makes sense? I may have any comments on that? Okay, so then we move to verse 25. How does a husband submit to his wife? What's the verse say? Love your wife as Christ loved the church. So you're going to meet her need for love and security through sacrifice. And because that's what Christ did. What does Christ's love look like? He came and he provides for the church a sense of love and care and forgiveness and security, and he ultimately died for the church. But then, after dying for the church, now what does he do every single day at the right hand of God? He lives for the church. Right? If you go to Acts and you look at the martyrdom of Stephen, Stephen looks up, the clouds are parted, and who's standing there? Jesus at the right hand of God, looking down, seeing what's going on with Stephen. So, a husband can meet his wife's needs by offering her love and security through sacrifice. Does that mean his wife is always going to be lovable? I'm going to go out here on a limb. This is the one that I feel very nervous about, just so you know. This is why Mother's Day sermons are all about how mom is wonderful and great, and Father's Day sermons are like, okay, men, shape up. Because preachers are totally happy talking to the men, but we're nervous talking to the women. But some of you aren't always as lovable as you ought to be. But husbands, do you love her only when she's lovable? If so, you're not subjecting yourself. See, these are the ideas. Do you only sacrifice for her when there's something in it for you? Then you're not subjecting yourself. Do you only look out for her needs when it's in your best interest to do so? If so, you are not subjecting yourself to her. And so in the relationship, it has to be completely based off of your reverence for Christ. It's not about how the person is acting in that moment, which is exactly why it's a tall order, right? Because when your husband is acting in a way that is not respectable, or your wife is acting in a not very lovable way, it is very hard to offer to them that thing that you feel they have not earned. And I will tell you from Ephesians, the picture is they haven't earned it. It has nothing to do with that. Why are you submitting to one another? In reverence for Christ. Their behavior in that moment is not part of the equation. It has nothing to do with it whatsoever. Any comments or questions? Yeah.
This goes back a little bit to where we started out with some of the descriptions of the word submitting. But I think where I struggle some is, for most people, I think the idea of submit, and you even talked about it with the definition of the word, is hierarchically something is going to be above something else. Mm-hmm. And I think where I struggle, and I feel like a lot of people struggle, is the idea of submitting, following that with each other. Well, if I submit to you and you submit to me, where do we fall on that hierarchy according to what the idea of submitting means? And it's trying to come to an understanding that both can exist. Mm-hmm. There's no the idea here is not to figure out what the final list of, where we fall is, but to always kind of be changing that based on the situation and how we respond to one another. For wives and husbands, for example, I'll use myself as an example. My wife knows that if she needs something, I will not hesitate to come help her or come do whatever it is that she needs help with. But by the same token, she knows that if it's something that she doesn't need to immediately help with, my help with, if I'm in the middle of something or doing something else, maybe I won't ask in this case because I respect that he's, in the middle of doing something that he's doing, and I'll handle it. And it's kind of the idea of balancing out where we find ourselves in terms of what we need in that subjection, like you were talking about earlier, meeting the needs of that person. If this is not an immediate need, then I know I can ask him, but maybe I won't in this case.
And that's an act of showing respect for your time, right? Which is your need. And so, yeah, part of the problem, I think you're right, is the hierarchical sense of it, right? So if I begin to think of it as who's on top and who's subject, then it's very easy to get into a mindset of this one's winning and this one isn't, right? But ideally, everybody's doing that, and it has nothing to, we're not counting that at all. Yeah?
Yeah, so parallel passage with this that I'm sure has been brought up at some point, 1 Corinthians 11:3. I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And so everyone would look at that and see God as the head of Christ, but they're both equally God.
Right.
And so they're still subject.
Mm-hmm.
You see the same thing out of man and woman. The passage is clear in 1 Corinthians as it is in Ephesians that the woman is in submission to man, but they're both equally human.
Right.
There's still equal value there, but one is submitting to the other.
Yep.
And so the hierarchical nature, whatever you want to call it, there's still equality in them both being God and them both being human, but one is submitting to the other.
Right. Well, and you do this all the time when you go to work, right? You go to work, you have a boss. Do you think the boss is a better human being than you, or worth more as a human being than you? No, you don't make that connection, right? The CEO of the company is not either more human or more valuable as a human being, but is there subjection within a company? Yeah. And in the same way, you look at the Father and the Son, there's subjection there, but nobody goes, oh, well, the Son is lesser than the Father. No, they're one. They're united. So, yeah, understanding that even though the term has this kind of above and below thing, it's not above and below value. It's not a value of worth. Men and women, the scriptures are very clear. In fact, there's no book that is more clear on the subject of the equality of value of men and women. Yes, and then yes.
One thing about the sacrificial nature of a husband's love towards his wife. I've had, being in the Army, there's a lot of alpha males, and there are things that they won't lower themselves to do. And having conversations around the ECP, the entry control point, talking about with other guys while cleaning your rifles, be like, I would die for my wife, but I'm not going to do dishes. And we think about the sacrificial love of Christ on the cross, but then we kind of glance over that he washed the feet of his servants. Mm-hmm. And so there's probably not a likelihood that you're going to have to defend your castle from an army of ninjas, but there probably is going to be a likelihood that you're going to have to do some work around the house, take out the trash, help your wife when she's sick.
Right.
It's the small things of sacrificial nature of love that we show our each other daily, which keeps our love tanks full, which let us know that we care for one another. It's sitting there and waiting for that big opportunity isn't sacrificial.
Right. Although, to be fair, the possibility your castle might need to be defended against ninjas is not zero. Right? It could happen.
It could.
Yeah. No, you're right. It's the day-to-day stuff, right? That's the real sacrifice that is right in front of you right then and there.
Well, I was just going to mention, you brought up the analogy of work, and I'm sure we'll get to it with the discussion of slave and master. But even in those situations, yes, the CEO is ranked above me in terms of his position, but ideally in a company that wants to continue on as best as they can, hopefully decisions are made not just from a standpoint of how much work can I squeeze out of my laborers in order to line my pockets, but what can benefit the company enough that everybody, me included, but also my workers, their bosses, and their bosses, all the way up to penny, all profit off of the continued existence of the business. So the subject there is that while I'm in control of the company, I'm hopefully making decisions based on the benefit of everybody involved and not just...
And you hear stories of that where there's a business owner, they have a couple hundred employees, and times turn bad, and the business owner is pulling out of their own pockets to keep everybody employed, right? So sometimes that does happen. We kind of hear the greedy Wall Street story, right? But the other also exists where somebody has an employee and they're taking the pay cut as the boss in order to keep that person employed. And that's another kind of subjection. So as we look in particular at the husband-wife relationship, one of the things that we should remember then is verse 32, this mystery is great, but I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. The relationship that Christ and His church are compared to is the husband and wife relationship. And it's a mystery how great Christ's love is for the church and how much the church matters to Him. That whole thing is a mystery that the closest you can come to unveiling it is get your marriage squared away. That's the closest you're going to come to understanding here on earth what's going on. And I will add another aspect that I don't have up here on the charts, but of subjection in a marriage is found in verse 31. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. When you get married, the in-laws are not in charge of your marriage. You leave and cleave. It has to be that way. That's part of being in subject to your spouse and their needs, right? I had an older woman when we first got married. She came and told me, she said, I told all my kids this and I'm telling you. And she was kind of like a mom to me. So it was very sweet of her to even kind of put me in that category. And she said, never, ever, ever tell your wife that doesn't taste like mom makes it. You never say that, right? That ship has sailed, right? You have a wife, and she is the best cook in the world. And there is that process of leaving and cleaving to build that relationship, and that's a subjecting to one another aspect of marriage that happens there as well. Okay, so as we move into chapter 6, there's several other relationships. Verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Children submitting to parents, they do it by meeting the parents' need for honor. Now that honor in childhood, at the younger years, looks like obedience. We see a transition that happens as the child gets older and leaves the house, as it moves into honoring without necessary obedience, right? Adult children are not required to obey everything that mom and dad said, but there is still an honoring aspect that goes on. The honoring just looks like obedience as a child. And the reason for that is parenting is a very difficult job. And the thing that kids can do to make that job easier on the parents is obedience. Because if it is a constant wrestle for power, and if you have a 2-year-old, you know exactly what I'm talking about, then you understand that that is a really hard thing. The goal is, as a child is growing up, for them to honor mother and father. And as has been mentioned before, that's not a license to mom and dad to be tyrants, right? That's not the whole goal of that at all. But instead, the very next thing you then see, after saying this is the first commandment with a promise, so it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth, which, by the way, that idea of it being the first commandment, is it literally the first commandment in the Bible? Honor your father and mother. Is that the first commandment that ever shows up? No. How is it the first commandment? In what way is it the first?
First one to us.
Yeah, it's the first one you get. You're this high, first thing you learn, obey mom and dad. And if you can get that one done, if you can get that idea figured out, it'll be well for you and you'll have a good life. Because as a general rule, even if you have godless parents, they want their kids to have a good life. As a general rule. You crisscross this country, you crisscross this world, and as a general rule, parents, even when they're making bad decisions, want their kids to make good decisions. My grandfather, who smoked and drank and every bad decision possible, turned to his son and said, "Don't you dare do any of those things," as he walked outside to smoke. Why? Because God builds it in. You want better for your kids than you. So if you will listen to that first commandment, it'll be well for you. And then the next one that follows it up is, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So parents, and in particular the emphasis is on fathers. Why fathers are emphasized here versus mothers? What are a couple of reasons that might be the case?
Fathers are more prone to the admonition side of things.
Okay, so one, just a general personality tendency due to gender, they're going to be more prone to the admonition side of it. Any others? Okay, another is buck stops with you, right? If you're your dad, you are, even though you're not doing a lot of the day-to-day decisions, the family identity falls on your shoulders. So the admonition here to fathers, don't provoke your children to anger. Right? So we provoke our kids to anger when anger is an outburst against perceived injustice. So don't be somebody who uses your power in an unjust way. Right? When our kids are little, it's particularly easy to see, I'm bigger than you, you're tiny. I can make you do whatever I want just because you are a quarter my size. Now at some point, you get a bond. And that begins to pivot. But it's very easy, especially when they're young, to just use power to get what you want. Don't do that. Provide consistency, provide fairness. Don't say no just because it's their favorite word doesn't mean it has to be your favorite word, right? You know, all of these sorts of things that we go through in the process of parenting. And one of the reasons, and I think, you touched on it there, that prone, I think kids are irrational. They just are irrational. And that is very frustrating to dads, I think, a lot of times, the irrationality of kids.
One other thing. As a father, we're in place of, or the stand-in for God the Father. Mm-hmm. And I think about the problem in nations where the fathers are absent, and dealing with those children and how they have such negative feelings about their father. Now granted, even if their father is, like you said, a bad father, but he's in the household, there's at least some level of respect.
Yeah.
But when there's an absent father, or if they're an abusive father, then I find it would be very difficult for that person, because when I think of a father, I think of a loving, kind, benevolent, generous, entity. But a person who's had a very horrible father or no father won't have that same kind of feeling.
Right.
So spiritually, it's difficult for that person even have a fond feeling towards God the Father.
Yep, and it skews their image of their spiritual father, for sure. Yeah. Yes?
It's really interesting to me. So this word for bring them up in verse 4 is the same word for nourish back in verse 29.
Yeah.
Only used 2 times in the New Testament used it. And so just thinking about fathers having the responsibility of nourishing them in your discipline and instruction.
Yeah, a great point.
The idea of, are you intentional in the diet you're giving your kids spiritually?
Yeah. You're in charge of what they're fed. And are you giving them a fair and balanced and complete meal? All of those things. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so as we're nearing time, looking at a couple other ones here. How does a slave submit to his master? Hard work and service. Here it says, verse 7, with good will render a service as the Lord and not to men. Remember, your reverence to God is part of the equation. The person you're serving is really secondary. Knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this you will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. Right? When you subject yourself to your master, in America we do not have the slave-master relationship. Gratefully, we don't exist in that world, but we do certainly live in relationships where there is somebody who has authority over somebody else. And typically we see that in the business environment. But in reality, the person in charge needs somebody to work for them that will work hard. You know, it's what every employer says. I just want them to show up on time and work hard full day. If they're coachable and trainable, we can start with that. And so, is that the kind of person that you are? And then how does a master submit to his slaves? By meeting the slave's need for gentleness and empathy. You notice verse 9, masters do the same things to them and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. So, once again, everybody's valued equally in the eyes of God, and be very careful about that. Just because you could threaten does not mean that should be your go-to method. Give it up. Give up threatening. That's not the system that God would desire if you are over people. So, with all of that in mind, starting next week, we're going to move into the armor of God. And the reason that we're going to need that armor is what we've just talked about. Because relationships are hard. And to live in a world with other people, good, bad, messy, everything, you're going to need that armor. Because we're in a spiritual battle, not against people, but against evil. And maybe comments or questions before we shut on down. Okay, we'll close up. Yep.
I would say that while all these are separated on how people meet the needs, you would have every single one of these examples to have a relationship. So while for husbands, they would put respect above love, we still throw love in the relationship. We still throw honor in there, throw hard work, ethics. Every single one of those for every single relationship.
Yeah, no doubt. It's not like, hey, my wife doesn't need respect. Right? If your takeaway is, hey, Scott's taught me my wife doesn't need respect, so then you missed the point. You're right. Yeah, you're right. Every single one of those relationships, these are valuable things at all. Okay, great. We'll close down there and we'll pick up in verse 10 next week.